Welcome to the second day of the ICS 10-year anniversary. It was amazing to see so many people come along last night and hear various accounts of the experiences at ICS over, 10 to 20 plus years actually. This morning's session is focused around ICS research in global settings, and it's framed around the terms trajectories, encounters, movement. I should have changed that to movement, so I'm kind of annoyed. So retrospectively, we might massage the website. Is it a bit loud?
We had background music to start with, and we've got to turn on.
I'm good at background music. I kind of Yeah, so to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that this session is being held on unceded Darug country, and I wish to acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal elders and custodians of this country, past, present and future. A little reminder, the session's being recorded like yesterday, and so if for any reason you don't wish to be recorded, you can talk to Sally Borley's. Now, I also wanted to thank the many people I've discovered who came together in organising this event. It's a longer list than I'd anticipated. We have Elise and Sally, Heather, Kay Anderson, David Rowe, Ian and Paul, James and Juan Salazar. That's quite an enormous team, and it shows you the kind of back end that goes into so many productions. So I have a little short introduction to the session today, and then we'll move to our wonderful speakers. The Institute for Culture and Society, as many of you know, is committed to addressing the urgent challenges that face our world now and into the future. These include economic instability and inequality, climate change, and the consequences of this urbanization and our relationship to the environment, intensifying technological modulations of labour and life, and changes and consequences of governing borders, migrants and citizens in the context of geopolitical change. These trends necessarily take our research out into the world, building new relations and modes of inquiry as we devise new questions, methods and practices to address concrete problems. Framed around ideas of trajectories, encounters and movements, this session probes how knowledge production is always already variational, creating frictions with established disciplinary conventions, while generating disciplinary renewal through practices of translation predicated on difference. Such modes of experience, coupled with knowledge production, are central to how ICS defines itself within academic, social and cultural contexts. The term trajectories is suggestive of a certain passage and orientation and organisation of coordinates, which make me think also of media of transmission and infrastructure of transportation. Neither planned as totality, nor entirely chaotic, trajectories throw us into the world as both signal and message. Trajectories shift our axes of alignment and cast routine life differently in any number of other global settings, cultural contexts, and social arrangements. There's some sort of correlation between the term trajectories and futurity, or trajectories and continuums or vectors. In the case of ICS, trajectories also speak to the heterogeneity of intellectual pursuits and the launch of ideas and agendas as researchers set out into the world. Then bring it all back home, or leave home, as is often the case, especially for ICS researchers undertaking PhD studies. The second framing term of this session is encounters, something for me that captures the experiential dimension of engaging difference in the world. The term works across spatial scales, from local to regional to global. It implies a potential unsettling of knowledge as assumptions we invariably hold about our objects of study run up against difference and variation, and a general refusal of people and things to submit or conform to prevailing analytic frameworks and conceptual apparatuses. Encounters are the engine of disciplinary transformation and the production of subjectivity. The final term, movements, speaks to bodies and brains in motion. Movements can also refer to the coalescing of political passions that catalyse structural change and cultivate new social imaginaries of other possible worlds. Combined, these three terms speak, at least I find, to much that ICS does as a collective endeavour to produce research that makes a difference in the world. Any number of other terms could signal and perhaps better encapsulate what's distinct about research at ICS. For now, though, the terms trajectories, encounters, movements work sufficiently as a placeholder that registers both ICS's foundations and its horizon as an institute reorienting toward the Asia Pacific, while maintaining ties to Latin America, Europe, India, and North America. I'm going to now introduce our speakers. I had actually, kind of crafted a series of questions, framing questions, that I'm now going to abandon and just move straight to the introduction, and I'll shift the dynamic a little bit of this session. First, though, the format will have 5 minutes from each speaker, followed by a panel discussion interspersed with questions. Speakers will briefly introduce a key aspect of the research, explaining how they think their experiences in international settings make their work distinct in ways that test and extend disciplinary boundaries. So first of all, we'll be running in the order in the program. We have trained as an architect with a specialization in conservation of built heritage. Vanika Arora has over a decade of experience working in India, focusing on urban regeneration, disasters, and heritage. Vanika is currently pursuing doctoral research at the Institute with a thesis that examines post-disaster reconstruction practices for heritage in Nepal, following the earthquakes of 2015 and 1934. Valentina Bauer is a senior research fellow at the Institute who's recently joined us, and is kind of the exception to the general composition of the panel, insofar as all of our speakers have come up through ICS PhD programs and moved on and into, doing the extraordinary things that they do. Valentina, you're the kind of wild, Valentina, you're the wild card here. So through her current ARC DECRA Research Fellowship on Development, Communication, Media and Peace in Protracted Displacement, she's investigating the use of communication for development and communicating with communities interventions aimed at promoting peace and countering violent extremism among young people in contexts of protracted displacement. Svetlina Hristova, our third speaker, works on topics that interrogate the political significance of digital technology through the prism of Marxist studies, science and technology studies, and political science. A PhD graduate from ICS, she's currently doing research on the intersection of temporality and visuality and its role in the automation of warehouse operations and white-collar labor. Isaac Lim has been researching social enterprise with a close focus on Cambodia for almost 15 years. A research fellow and another PhD graduate from the Institute, Isaac's currently working on building a project called Building the Evidence Base on the impacts of mobile financial services for women and men in farming households in Laos and Cambodia. This is a 5-year project commissioned by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Finally, it's an absolute delight to welcome Georgie Ravulo back to Western Sydney at ICS. Georgie is the Professor and Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. He's the first person to graduate, I didn't know this, with a Doctor of Cultural Research through ICS. His writings and research are in the areas of interest that include mental health and well-being, alcohol and other drugs, youth development, marginality, and decoloniality. So thank you, dear speakers, very much for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have you and to get a sense of how, your experience in many different contexts translates into your research practice. So we'll just run straight through speakers now, about 5 minutes each, and then we'll open up for discussion. So first of all, we have Vanika, and you can speak here or there, whatever you prefer.
Feels like a 5-minute thesis, but Hi everyone, and thank you for the very long introduction. I'd like to approach today's panel primarily through the framing of trajectories and encounters, because the term movements has scarred me being unable to move for several years now. Anyway, that's not today. Very briefly, I'd like to talk about a few moments of exchange that I had off and on the field, and how these might have impacted the way that I've approached my research. In 2019, a few disaster research academics issued what is known as the Disaster Studies Manifesto, which was in response to growing calls for decolonizing research methodologies and decentering predominantly Western paradigms of carrying out social research. The manifesto suggests that researchers consider a wide diversity of local epistemologies and ontologies and recenter local agendas. This manifesto cautions that often disaster researchers, and you can take that word disaster out and put any other kind of social research in there, that they operate from a cultural deficit and that they miss out on capturing and presenting local realities. So what was my specific cultural deficit? I am Indian origin, from an Australian institution who had engaged with a specific local context within Nepal. My position as researcher, a female, Hindu, dominant caste, foreign, and yet not foreign enough, influenced almost every interaction I had in Bhaktapur, Nepal. In some interactions, the balance of power and privilege was clearly skewed, while in others, a common language, professional background, religion negotiated some of these differences. For instance, my gatekeeper Sahana, who was also my landlady, no power differential there, would often introduce me as an Australian researcher to certain participants and an Indian resident or an Indian student to others. She claimed that not everyone would be willing to speak to me given the ongoing political tensions between India and Nepal at the time, and that I should lean into different identities as I spoke to different people. So in some interactions I would talk in English, emphasizing a distance from my obvious South Asianness and my Indianness, while in others I'd lean into the other identity and lapse into Hindi and talk about Bollywood and our respective political messes. Did this influence my interviews? Obviously. But many of these nuances are difficult to capture in a thesis, especially one that's written in a single language. My research trajectory shifted significantly before fieldwork. At ICS, following 14 weeks of keywords, including the words globalization, culture, and community, I found myself quite intimidated by the vastness of the theoretical landscape that everyone around me seemed to be very, very comfortable in. As not only an international HDR, but also an architect among social scientists. It took me a while to learn the language, and I don't think I fully understand the local customs and the codes even now. When I finally began fieldwork, I was once again more.
Hey, so I'm actually going to talk in a completely different way and not so much speak about my personal experience, and I hope this is okay. I warned that this is what I'm going to do. So when Ned wrote to me about this topic, I actually started thinking about the very interesting interactions and relationships between institutions, disciplines, and academic knowledge in local settings, but also internationally. And I was reminded of two very interesting examples of personal stories of how certain discipline and develops institutionally. One was from the autobiography of Benedict Anderson, where he's explaining his professional biography. And the other one was two scholars from Northern Macedonia, who explained, Ristovsky and Yakimovska, who explained institutional biography of their Department of Anthropology and how it develops in a very specific way, because they all have a background in ethnology, which is a very European-centric discipline, and how this shapes the kind of knowledge that they produce and the kind of approach to anthropology that they have. And in a way, what these two stories are showing is to the extent to which the formation of disciplines is to some extent serendipitous. So it's all about kind of the encounters and the specific historical and geographical context of where this group of people congregates. But what is interesting is how this seemingly fluid and very open to experimentation boundaries of disciplines tend to solidify, and how this happens. And this is quite relevant also for somebody who comes from a minor academic culture like me, because of the way these processes kind of solidify boundaries that leave certain types of knowledges and certain stories and certain perspectives out. And so I'm gonna give another example of something that happened recently in Bulgaria, which is again a commentary on the relationship between international aspects of scholarship, institutions, and disciplines. And recently, the Minister of Education in Bulgaria had this drive to introduce international standards for the quality of scholarship into the country, and create a kind of point system for evaluation of the knowledge that is produced. And part of it was listing certain journals that count as valid knowledge productions. And it turned out that for the humanities and social sciences in Bulgaria, because he had chosen the Web of Science, none of the Bulgarian journals, the Bulgarian-speaking journals, counts as valid knowledge. And this is, I mean, you can argue that this is kind of a stupid bureaucratic drive that he had, but it is actually interesting how this internationally, there are kind of, there is definitely a hierarchy of what counts as valid knowledge on the international scene and what doesn't. And to a big extent, these kind of boundaries and hierarchies are established by the institutions of, publishing, different ranking systems of universities, etc. And what this means is that certain types of knowledge just remains outside, even though there are valid reasons for why a certain, for instance, concerns with local problems are important. For specific types of narratives that do not fit the structure the expected structure of an article in an Anglo-Saxon journal, for example. But my question is, I was kind of wondering what happens in this case, and I'm actually very skeptical about the possibilities of translation and kind of subsumption of local knowledges in international scholarship, exactly because of this type of hierarchies that always play into what type of narratives, what type of stories, what type of texts are counted as valid through different systems of evaluation. And so this is kind of very general commentary, but it is also to some extent personal that I have I have separated to a big extent my experience from Bulgaria and the kind of narratives and analysis that I produce about Bulgarian politics and Bulgarian society to what I'm doing in the institute and the kind of research that I'm doing here. And so this is, I think this is what I'm going to say, just kind of a general commentary about the politics of knowledge.
Going to time myself. Okay, so thank you for inviting me today. It's an honour to be able to talk about my time at ICS, which is a long time now, since 2013, pushing 10 years. And I would just like to start my talk with this slide, which I used when I was a HDR in ICS in the 3-minute thesis competition back in 2015, which I look back on this experience very fondly. It was great to take part in that and also to go through to the final round. It was quite interesting to engage with other researchers in other fields in the final. So I look on it fondly, but the slide shows, I think, some of the accumulated impacts on my thinking that academic life in ICS had by that point in time. I had come to ICS from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom, where I studied international development and continued as a teacher and researcher. And I was focusing there on social enterprise in teaching and research, and also at the Royal University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia, where I had a project ongoing. At that time I was drawing on the management literature on social enterprise primarily and supplementing it with insights from international development from my previous studies. I would say that my familiarity with social enterprise up to that point had been driven by Western literature, including management literature, especially on social entrepreneurship, which was rapidly surpassing the previous discussion about the social economy. And drawing from my training, my original PhD proposal, when I came to study under Catherine Gibson, was mobilising critical realism, grounded theory and case studies. And Catherine was happy to let me do my own thing, as Valentina just said, you're not put into boxes here and you have quite a lot of freedom. By the time I finished my confirmation of candidature under the supervision of Catherine and Louise Crabtree, I was a post-structuralist action researcher instead. Finding my feet took a lot of time with my COC. So I arrived at ICS sceptical of narratives inherent to social entrepreneurship anyway. I was very sceptical of the idea of brave, heroic individuals from a critical realist perspective, but I had not really considered up to then the Western centricity of the underlying principles of social entrepreneurship, or for that matter the concepts underpinning the raison d'etre for social enterprises, namely a financially sustainable organisation filling gaps in public services that, as Indu pointed out yesterday evening, put going to a large scale at the foremost of their objectives. Through engagement with human and economic geography rather than the management literature, particularly the community economies research with J.K. Gibson-Graham, Stephen Healy, Jenny Cameron, I entered into field work doing action research where encounter and movement, or body and brain in motion, were intrinsic to the action research design. As J.K. Gibson-Graham would refer to this, it's enchantment, bodily learning and experiencing new subject positions personally and as part of a research collective with 10 villages in eastern Cambodia. We experimented with social enterprise in the end, at in the final stage of the action research. And I was brought to critically reflect on social entrepreneurship ethics in particular through Foucauldian positions of care of the self, in conversation with Buddhist ethics, merit-making practices, cognitive science to some extent. While I had always sensed that social enterprise as a policy tool implied a neoliberal governmentality, particularly imposing conditions onto non-profits who are supposed to be formed autonomously, who are supposed to have their own direction and emerge organically. I'd always been aware of that, but along the way I was brought to think more about, well, how am I being perceived? What's my positionality in this research? And what is the positionality of Western practitioners preaching social enterprise in Cambodia? With all of its colonial past, perhaps there's a very strong air of coloniality in the social enterprise in practice and in theory at the level of international development currently, and I think these are important questions that are still not going addressed. Where's the... Oh dear, that's me. I don't know how to move the slide along. All right, okay. Yeah, okay then, just very quickly. Since then, I've also had reason to reflect on other data that I collected prior to my PhD. For example, the United Nations Creative Industry Programme, initiated to support Indigenous resident APRA associations in northern Cambodia. I was introduced to this programme and went to the villages equipped with questions targeting social entrepreneurship concepts and economic solidarity. And at that time I wasn't sure what to make of the expressed reasoning by members of one association in particular for actually starting their resin association. Their reasoning seemingly had little to do with resin itself or the immediate monetary benefit. There was firstly talk of conservation, which made sense to me, but then talk turned to animist beliefs and other non-forest timber products that they use in their everyday life and also to barter with. Through the familiarity I had gained with diverse economies thinking at ICS, I was able to see the Western centricity of this value chain driven creative industries programme more clearly. And in this instance, I could speculate how spiritual practices and portfolios of livelihood are bound in the everydayness of social enterprise in rural Cambodia. And helping me to set up, then I say, a different epistemic trajectory than the social enterprise literature generally affords, or perhaps I could say a complementary trajectory to the literatures around social enterprise and community building elsewhere. Thank you.
Nisam Pulavanaka and G'day, I'm Chochi Ravulo, and before I begin I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, the people, the Darug people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. To also acknowledge the lands that we're gathered is still considered stolen as sovereignty was never ceded, and to further reiterate an ongoing commitment to work collaboratively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I always try and give a practical example of how I'm holding myself accountable in doing that. I'm lead editor on a handbook that's been created. It's called the Handbook of Critical Whiteness, Deconstructing Dominant Discourses Across Disciplines. It's being published by Springer. We're still looking for contributors, by the way. And I'm working alongside some dear colleagues from Western Sydney University, and we're going to obviously try and get a broader understanding of how whiteness pervades different disciplines and disciplinary areas. And it's actually through my involvement with ICS that I'm able to do this work. Literally. I am a product of Western Sydney University. So I'm going to just share my very short life trajectory and give an overview of how the Institute for Culture and Society has been foundational in my ability to do what I do today. Western Sydney University, I've done all my degrees here at Western Sydney University. I was part of their vision in the sense of first in family, grew up in public housing in southwestern Sydney, and did my social work degree back in 1999 to 2002. It was through my involvement in my social work degree here at Western Sydney University that I grew to develop a passion for working across the region, the local region. I wanted to learn more, so I did a year working in the community, and I maintained that work as I then started my Masters of Education, where I developed a further insight into how learning is a form of social change and the transformative nature of education. But soon after, right after I finished my Masters of Education in 2005 and 2006, I enrolled in the newly created Doctor of Cultural Research. And my principal supervisor, who I'm delighted is here, is Professor Bob Hodge. And Greg Noble was also my secondary supervisor. And it was actually through your supervision that I then developed a greater passion and area of interest in the topic area that I was exploring. I was working still full-time whilst doing my DCR, and my DCR was on the development of antisocial behaviour in Pacific youth. As a social worker, I was working out in the community in Western Sydney with young offenders, especially those from a Pacific Indigenous background who were overrepresented in the legal system. And so my DCR was exploring, why is that happening? And for me, the DCR, through the then Centre for Cultural Research that then became ICS, provided the context, the platform, the ability to see that research can be real. That research can provide broader contexts and understandings as to what is happening in space and place. Soon after graduating in 2010 with the DCR, I then reluctantly accepted a 12-month contract to be a lecturer, a social work lecturer in the School of Social Sciences and Psychology here at Western Sydney University. And it was through my engagement in my first year as an academic, again I went reluctantly because at the time I was working as a manager of a youth accommodation service for homeless young people in Fairfield. But it was through my first year of becoming an academic that I started to understand my assemblage of social work, education and cultural research, and the way in which those various disciplines provided me with the context to make research real. So I was involved in developing community-based projects through my academic role that was working on widening participation projects, so working with communities that traditionally don't see further education and training as a reality. So I was helping to mobilise projects with the Office of Widening Participation here at Western Sydney University, and also developing a partnership with the University of the South Pacific to send social work students to do their final fourth year placements in the islands themselves. And again, it was through the assemblage that I was able to create through my DCR via social work and education that I was able to mobilise these particular research projects that were very much still community-led, driven and regionally focused within Western Sydney, but also the Pacific region as well. So I spent nearly 8 years here at Western Sydney University. I moved from being a lecturer then to a senior lecturer, and then I received an appointment as an associate professor at the University of Wollongong, and I was their first full-time academic based at the Liverpool campus at Southwestern Sydney, yep. And there, over the 3 years that I was there, from 2008 to 2021, I further developed my understanding again of how to really develop HDR, high degree research, supervisory skills and practices that again supported students to make research real. I got that again from models like Bob, like Greg, like what I saw with David, like what I saw with Ian from ICS. And so I bring that with me. And a year ago in March last year, I was appointed as the Professor and Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies at the University of Sydney. At the same time of my appointment, I became the first person of a Pacific heritage to become a professor in Australia. And that is exciting, it is exciting. But again, it's because of ICS. I genuinely mean that. It was transformational for me that I was able to make research real and know that even though I'm an academic full-time, I still connect my knowledge base, my perspectives to community, and it forms my ongoing trajectory in knowledge creation with community, alongside community, in supporting a shared destination, a collaborative destination, one that is informed meaningfully by Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. Again, concepts and perspectives I learned from my DCR. So I'm forever grateful for the way in which ICS has been a platform for me to move into being involved in my ability to create and share knowledge as part of my journey as an academic.
Well, thanks a lot for a series of entirely fascinating talks there. There's so much that you've opened up for discussion. I just want to proceed with a single question to each of the researchers and then move quickly into a wider discussion with you all. So Lanika, I love this term cultural deficit. It's not one I've heard actually, I don't think, in relation to research practice. And I was curious about how, despite moving into these spaces with an acknowledged cultural deficit, you're nonetheless required, to identify the condition of disaster within some kind of knowledge framework. So I was a bit interested if you had any thoughts on how moving into a space with cultural deficit, if you then kind of, constitute another kind of disaster.
I think it should, yeah. So I don't think anyone researching any place, any situation is operating without some kind of a cultural deficit. But I do think that certain kinds of researchers are asked to explain their specific deficits more than others. And I entered the field 4 years after the earthquake. And I still had to fill in the ethics application as if the earthquake was 2 days ago. The memories of the earthquake did not directly come up in my questionnaire because it wasn't about that. It was about life that had picked up in the years that had followed. And it wasn't my intention to bring up traumas of the disaster, but often people would be eager to talk about it. I think there is a danger in assuming that while looking at a disaster or a post-disaster context, that you could create a certain kind of a knowledge disaster, and it has happened, particularly in disaster studies, it happens over and over again. But I think by acknowledging or recognizing that it doesn't actually necessarily matter if you are Nepali, Indian, or Australian, all three could create different kinds of disasters depending on the power dynamics that they choose to deploy in the field. and I'm not denying the intersection of race, of language, of class. Of course, all of these imbalances exist. But I think sometimes we are so consumed with the structural that we begin to excuse the power dynamics that might exist within the local. And that is the kind of fine-grainedness that is often missing in disaster research. That's what I've tried to do.
Yeah. And Valentina, yeah, I was particularly interested in the way you have this very wide and deep experience working with NGOs in particular, and the way working across these different organizational cultures, requires you to negotiate and translate, I would imagine, different kinds of agendas and the kind of tensions that happen within and across organizations, and how from that you build up an analysis. I mean, have you got any thoughts on, negotiating organizational conflicts?
Yes, thanks for the question. It's always challenging when I'm on field work or doing a project, having to sort of deal not just with the partner organization, who would be sort of the main NGO or the UN agency with UN agents, but also the partner of the partners, as well as the sort of the people on the ground, the local realities and the various community leaders, etc. There are so many different dynamics going on there, and negotiating is definitely one of the main sort of tasks that the researcher, I think, has, because there is a lot. Some things really matter for some people, and they don't matter so much for other people. And when you're working, especially with big agencies, there is only a certain language that you can use, and there are only certain things that you can say. So it's incredibly frustrating, especially when we're thinking of the idea of academic freedom and how we want to put out there what's happening in a way that represents everyone and that really tells the truth about what's going on in a particular situation. And at the same time, you want to keep a relationship with the gatekeepers. So yeah, I think this is a big challenge of doing this kind of research. Thank you.
Well, Svetlina, I was really thrilled actually that you raised the matter of serendipity. It's not something we hear about very often at all, and how it's a kind of fundamental condition for invention. Sebastian Ulmer wrote a really lovely little book on serendipity and knowledge production as well. And I think you start to offer us a diagnosis of the dire condition of research, generally speaking, in the Australian Academy, within a society of measure, as we come under increasingly assault by audit cultures. So what that then means going forward for ICS is a serious matter, I think. But I particularly like the way you spoke about, nevertheless, despite that prevailing condition, despite these kind of comical attempts to impose that within other national settings outside of Anglophone regimes and knowledge production, it doesn't work. And that there are spaces for serendipity to prevail despite the imposition and prevalence and reproduction of these regimes. And I kind of liked particularly then the possibility for doing kind of a secret knowledge, and the way you have these kind of two tracks that you work on here. And maybe you could say something about secrecy of knowledge, perhaps.
I'm not sure what I can say about secrecy and knowledge.
Well, no one knows about your secrets, put it that way.
I guess what I might take from your question is that, yeah, obviously, I think that one of the reasons I'm I've decided to kind of separate the particular topics that are related to Bulgaria, to migration, to Eastern Europe, as something that is done outside of the institutional framework of my employment, as really linked to the kind of specific personal sense of personal importance and urgency that I feel about how I can write about issues like this, and the possibility to actually escape particular conventions of how you structure a text, or what kind of arguments you make, or how you present the narrative.
Oh, thank you. Isaac, thanks very much for your account there. What interested me was the examples you gave of the relationship between theory and practice. And I found it particularly interesting when you start talking about spiritual practices that bound to the everyday, that set up, as you said, different epistemic trajectories. I found that idea intriguing. While you nevertheless, proceed with this quite, if I can say, British paradigm around social entrepreneurship and innovation and enterprise. So I'm interested how the spiritual dimension, for example, or any others that you may think of, start to push up against that type of framing and maybe prompt you to bring different kind of conceptual modes or apparatuses to bear that displace, if you like, the kind of register of entrepreneurship per se.
I would say, well...
Oh, sorry, you need to speak right to the mic, I'd like you swallow it, I think.
I would say that there are examples and things that I observed in my research where I brought that to bear. I think that the ethics of social entrepreneurship became super interesting because in the management literature, I mean, yes, I continue with that literature because my PhD was about critiquing it and saying, how can we look at it differently? But the ethics of social entrepreneurship is very naturalised. It's assumed that a social entrepreneur somehow has this natural ethical fibre, as if there are no tensions and dilemmas in running a business with social objectives. But what I found, for example, especially in patient-client relationships, is that equity doesn't actually make sense to people necessarily. I mean, as Annika was saying, I don't want to say that there aren't inequalities, there definitely are, but when people have a sense of responsibility in a patron-client relationship, I encountered a village chief who he would let people take out microfinance loans on his land, under his land title. If that's not using the market to the betterment of people in his constituency, I don't know what is. And he managed to leverage capital to bring in a road, which resulted in a bottled water factory at the back of the village. He was a village planner, he was an entrepreneur, but he was not selfless. And he had the village well built right next to his house with a pipe going straight from the well into his house. I mean, it was completely unequal. But and the Western-centric perspective from outside would say that this person is corrupt, or I said that this person is reconciling conflicting tensions in the ethical process of being an entrepreneur and community developer. And I have several other examples along those lines in my work.
Yeah, and Georgia, it's wonderful to hear your account. I mean, clearly your intellectual formation is very much kind of embedded and born out of your life experience within Western Sydney. And so I was particularly interested at that moment where you talked about moving that out into the Pacific and the type of encounters that you might have had there. And I wondered if you might say something about how those experiences translate back into the way you do research locally, and maybe have, I don't know, perhaps shifted the type of practice that you do as a result of that.
Thank you. When I was setting up the Pacific Islands Field Education Initiative back in 2013-14 here at Western Sydney University, it was very easy for me to go into the Pacific Islands themselves. I'm from a Pacific Indigenous background myself, my father's Sidolke Fijian. It was easy for me to go to places like Fiji, Tonga, Samoa and Vanuatu where we were sending our students and uphold this dominant Western white discourse, white is right, West is best, dominant thinking around, and the paternalistic thinking that they need our social work program, they need to learn from us to be better. And it was actually through that program that I was able to then help mobilise an edited collection that was published by Routledge called Pacific Social Work that further demystified that concept and the constructs that go with that. And create a definition of Pacific social work which is around centering Pacific Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, whilst also countering anti-oppressive structures and inequalities. And I've taken what I've learned from my engagement as an academic, as a researcher, from the region where I'm an Indigenous person of, and I've applied it back here to then further facilitate research that's focused on areas of decolonisation, decoloniality, and areas that, again, strive to disrupt dominant discourses. And again, it's because of my ability to understand what might be happening in the broader Pacific region and how we as an Australian state further perpetuates that paternalistic approach. And so a lot of my ongoing work now, to the point where actually, a bit of a plug, I did an op-ed last week that was published inviting Penny Wong to come meet with the Pacific diaspora here in Australia, because by virtue of Penny working with the Australian government, working with the diaspora on our social needs here, it further mobilises a relationship to the region itself, because of the inextricable connection that we still have with our countries of origin. So a lot of that stuff, again, has been developed from that co-creation of knowledge.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for elaborating your ideas a bit more there. We have a bit of time, a good amount of time, 25 minutes, until lunch. So I'd like to open it up to the audience. We're a little bit short of microphones. So what should we do with this? A microphone will come your way if you have a question. So who would like to pose one? Yeah, great.
I'll ask questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. My voice is.
I will use a mic now because
is it okay?
you'd be surprised.
Okay.
Very much.
Sorry, I'm always reluctant to use this because it's too loud. It's probably my knees are in the background. So thank you so much for your contributions. And I guess my question is somewhat to everyone at ICS, as well as yourselves, as people who are kind of placed in different locations within ICS. So, you know, something that came out really strongly in my sense as well is that ICS is a really open space, right, in terms of disciplinary influences, encouraging kind of research and action or action-based research, as well as relational kinds of research, which is great. At the same time, there are obvious constraints within which ICS is placed, and also some flags that ICS is carrying very proudly, which they should, around, I guess, the kind of quantitative and qualitative measurements of what is academic success, what is an accomplished research institute, and ICS is one. And you know, we're talking about publications, we're talking about getting ARC grants, etc. And I wonder if you, in your work, encounter kind of any kind of tension, I suppose, between the action research as well as relational research and how long it takes to develop relational research and kind of like dynamics that entails, and having to meet very clear requirements and you know, the production of success that is, or what constitutes success that is still westernized, even within ICS, as open-minded as it is. Thanks.
Anyone like to?
Well, for action research for me, I was lucky that I had
Sorry, I'll just interrupt. I think the little mic you might need to kind of somehow hold. Is it?
Hold up to your chin.
Yeah, great.
I think action research definitely is. actually quite difficult for a PhD student to do. Mine took a year in 3 cycles, and the first 3 months was all about building relationships and just building a team of 10 people, bringing us close together. So there's constant activities. I drew on a few handbooks on asset-based community development and appreciative inquiry. So there's some tools about developing momentum and bringing people together and developing an appreciation of the community. But I was also lucky to be partnering with a Buddhist NGO who I'd met a year earlier and who I continue to work with today. So that's now a 9-year ongoing relationship that I have with that organisation. In fact, they were also part of the film that Juan made. They helped to facilitate that. So I continue to work with them on their board of directors. So I think you've got the action research part, but then trying to maintain things after that it can be challenging at times as well. I think that for me anyways, it's always the cultural thing that's always there. There's always, how am I viewed by them, and how, on what terms am I appreciated, and through what lens am I looking at this organisation, even when I try to be as open-minded as possible. It's learning experience.
Any other thoughts on that before we move to the next question?
So I haven't yet had to meet the extremely high standards of being a successful academic, and I can argue because I'm still doing my PhD, so it's kind of fine. But to me, there are like 2 different ICSs. There is this kind of a forum where you can get away by saying many things and articulating fairly critical ideas and thinking through complicated theoretical landscapes and still being safe. So there is the safe ICS internally. And then there is the fact that it is an institution that, as we heard yesterday, makes money. And in order to make money, whether you're an architect or an academic, the rules are kind of the same. There is someone who's paying you, and you need to meet their expectations. So in that sense, I don't necessarily have the same shock of any institution having to address the neoliberal framework within which we all operate. But at the same time, within the safe space, you can do, and so I think there are pushbacks and small pockets of things that you can do and resist. And I've seen that ICS does a lot of resistance. When I speak to academics across the university, there are eye rolls occasionally about how we resist. And I'm pretty proud of that. So I think it does both things simultaneously, and that's fun.
David, I think had a question.
Thanks for the session. It's going really well, I think. I've got a kind of methodological question, field methodological question, and just preface it with the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. It was noted that when he was talking to, say, the Confederation of British Industry, he would sound like the Oxford graduate that he is. When he was visiting a constituency in, say, South London, the Midlands or the North, he would take on a different accent altogether. For example, the so-called estuarine accent of South East England, which has become the common person. So, in that sense, I just wonder about the ethical and pragmatic decisions that you have to make, that you've all had to make in the field, I guess, as to which register, which persona do you adopt at any one time? Where do you feel that you're being, in some sense, your authentic self? Where do you think that you're faking it, but for the best possible reasons?
For me, in the field. I suppose because of the reasons that I was mentioning earlier. There's just so many different stakeholders, many different groups that you have to sort of relate to, interact with, and really make sure that you understand what they need and that they understand what you can offer. I think I am my authentic self when I'm writing. That's really the moment where I'm completely honest, both to myself, to my research participants, and everyone else. That doesn't mean that the final product reflects exactly that authenticity, but I think that the writing, the analysis, the writing is, it's what research offers that is different from everything else, even from a consultancy. That there's so many research consultants in development these days. They go in 10 days, interview 100 people. I don't know how they manage, and they write these reports in 3 days. But we do things differently, and I think that's a beauty and of actually taking the time to understand the data and what's in front of us and the opportunities that we can provide with our findings.
I've learned to now be my authentic self. When I started as a professor last year at the University of Sydney, I thought that I'd have to model myself against other professors there, but I soon learned that it was about me just being me. I went through this whole thing of when I was appointed that, am I diversity hired, all those sort of things, right? Because it's like, why did I become a professor? But then I quickly realised a couple of months in that I needed to just be myself, because that's why I got where I got to, and I have to bring my authentic self to that conversation in my research, in my role as an academic, as someone that heads up a department, as someone that interacts with lots of different people, and it's through that I think enables me to actually be comfortable with my authentic self. And very quickly, I remember, again, I'm coming back to supervision days with Bob, I remember sitting in his office and we were reviewing parts of my portfolio we're putting together for the DCR, and I was sort of waiting to get this further feedback and validation from Bob in regards to the value of my work and what it was actually trying to convey. And he quickly said to me, well, no, you're the person that's doing the research. You come from this field, you understand it. And it was a real moment in time for me to be empowered to actually feel like my lived experience, my understanding, my authenticity and what I bring to the research matters. And that's what then translates across most of all of my research and writing now.
I had a very interesting experience in terms of field work, because I made the conscious choice not to do research in Bulgaria, because often what happens when somebody from, the global south or second, third world goes to a Western institution is that they kind of get trapped into this role of having to act as the mediator or translator of their own local context, and to kind of provide the empirical material that will be interpreted through frameworks that are established in the West. And I did research in India, and it was also a research setting that was in professional circles. So most of the people that I interviewed and that I interacted with were professionals, high caste, high class, etc. And I find it was quite discomforting, but I think that there is a great value in the discomfort of ethnography and fieldwork. And I'm not sure whether I would ever think about an authentic self in terms of communicating and getting from, in different situations, because people adopt different roles in different situations. But I think that exactly this sense of having to negotiate and to act and to feel discomfort is really valuable.
Any other questions from you? Sorry, I don't know your name, but you...
Daniel.
And then Adam.
So I'm a little timid about asking this question. I'll leave it up to your judgment whether it's related or not. But working in student community here, the question I'd love to ask is, would you be willing to imagine how the kind of work that you do and what the Institute represents could have more of a presence in this space, this campus, this student community? My first encounter with the Institute was at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And when I started reading and looking at what was coming out of the Institute, it was so exciting that I thought, wow, what is this place? I began to have this ambition of coming to work at Western Sydney because really what was coming out of the Institute was so exciting, so interesting. I have to say that I've often sat outside the walls of the Institute and sort of wondered if there's any way those locked doors or somehow to be able to tangibly connect to the incredible work that's being done there. And sometimes I working with students, I think, oh, I wish is there a gap, some place where the incredible work that happens in the Institute could be more embodied or tangibly a part of the community here, of student culture here, which seems to me, Western Sydney being what it is, could be an incredibly exciting and interesting thing that would reinforce a lot of what we hope students will encounter here in their experience.
I agree, and I've taught at the university as a tutor in a bunch of different eclectic units, and I've dragged, and I'm intending to drag a couple of academics with me to teach in those courses, whether they volunteered or not. And sometimes there are different ways of doing it. I'm not sure we are always successful. And I noticed that because I've had students come up to me and say, where are you from? We've not seen you. Because everyone assumes that I'm from the School of Social Sciences. I'm not. And then I say I'm from ICS. They're like, where's that? I'm like, it's the, the back corner, the nice building that it's right there. And then we have a conversation and they're like, oh, it sounds like an interesting place. What do people do there? I'm like, they do research. And I definitely think the link between pedagogy and research needs to be stronger and clearer. Otherwise, what's the point? But there are a bunch of different ways that I know that people at ICS are already doing this. Perhaps not as successfully as they could, but it's happening, just not. You're right, the visibility, a cafe would be nice, or or just a couple of. We've had a couple of initiatives like the Key Lectures and Thinker series and different workshops that are run for HDRs of all units, and I've noticed they're pretty well attended. Perhaps more of those then, yeah.
Maybe there could be an ICS festival, maybe once a year in a room like this, where ICS researchers showcase their work to perhaps second, third year undergraduate students, even for them to think about their honors and plans for the future if they want to stay in research. So I think that could be an idea of how the center could be more connected to the students on campus and in other campuses.
Outside of the teaching, initiatives that are being implemented within the university that can be engaged, such as in my case, I'm advising on the Voice of Young Social Entrepreneurs initiative, a Voicey, which is not a course, it's an alpha app that students can actually do, and they will have a, what do they call it, a hackathon at the end of it. So I'm trying to bring my training in ICS to bear more on that with the designers who are currently coming at it, frankly, from a very management background. So we may bring asset-based community development and other tools that are used by community economies into that module.
Adam, did you?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Not so
yes.
well.
No. Just hold that right here. All right. I'm going to just project.
That's the idea.
So my question was sort of spurred by Isaac, by something that you were saying, and kind of this tension that it seemed like you were negotiating of being very critical of terms like a social entrepreneur and what that kind of project might be, but then also not doing what we see a lot, or at least what I've seen a lot from my own academic worlds, where the move is just to explode the whole term and we shouldn't use it. We'll come up with a new term coined by us, cited, et cetera. But then that got me thinking too, also in Valentina, your discussion of the sort of tensions between being sort of unplaceable within disciplines. And I wonder if maybe any of the panelists want to sort of reflect on the specific value of continuing to use terms that we know don't fit quite right, or is there some kind of specific benefit that we get by struggling with those, the landscape as it is, so to speak, as opposed to kind of just calling for its complete abolition and a kind of reworking from the ground up?
Well, I'm going to speak for my field in the sense that I think my field is still a relatively emerging one. So there isn't a journal on that, or like it's it's still difficult to place. And so if by simply saying, okay, I'm just going to drop it all together and maybe do more work a little bit more in this direction, then it's also a bit of a loss. And I believe it's our job as scholars in this field to actually do more about it and to actually be more out there, even just as peer reviewers accepting papers, like, okay, I'm going to peer review this paper, because if my paper is sent to 3 people in communication for development and the 3 of them say no, then it's just going to be sent to someone else in media, or in peace studies, and then it becomes a bit complicated. So I think it's also our role to be more forthcoming and to be more committed to the area that we have chosen.
I was saying, I don't think I'm trying to explode that concept so much as to, what I was really trying to do is to address the way that this is being mobilised in development, because I just don't think there's any way of escaping that. My experience in Cambodia prior to coming here, when I was running the National Social Enterprise Conference of Cambodia for 3 years. I mean, I think it is an authentic concept. It's a concept Cambodians relate to. There's kind of a friction. It becomes something else. But the Buddhism for Social Development Action, the CEO of that, Van Dong, is definitely an entrepreneur, and he's very proud of himself as being an entrepreneur. And he started the Young Entrepreneurs Association of Cambodia Kampong Cham chapter, and he's now aspiring probably to go into politics at the end. But definitely there is entrepreneurship and an authentic understanding of that in Cambodia. But I think my conversation in my thesis anyway, and since then, has been with development and their idea of sustainability around social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. That the concept has value, but it's it's trying to ground it in place and see it as a place-based concept, but also perhaps being something else. I don't know, I didn't get that far as what else would it be, but definitely resilience and perhaps social innovation becomes more of an appropriate kind of broader thing to think about, because social entrepreneurship is definitely individualizing people, responsibilizing people, attributing characteristics that don't translate across cultures. For me, merit making was something that's so significant in terms of people's incentive for action as a Buddhist practice. So that's, speaking to what Ned was saying earlier, that's a literature that I really did go into in quite a lot of detail, is Buddhist merit making practices in the Theravada context, trying to understand how people's subjectivities are both collective and individual at the same time when they do merit making practices. Those were all, I think, really interesting things for understanding this Western-centric concept kind of locally.
I think it's our responsibility to disrupt. I use disrupt, deconstruct, decolonize a lot. And I think it's about being able to, for me, I'm conscious that I need to disrupt diplomatically, because sometimes if I become too assertive, I become an angry person of colour. So I'm conscious of the way in which I disrupt, but at the same time I'm conscious of our duty again to bring people alongside the journey with us as we are disrupting dominant discourses. I know I keep on talking about that, but that's so important when it comes to transforming communities, individuals, families within their broader contexts. So I think it's really important that we continue to share that conversation with everyone.
Unfortunately, this is a particularly interesting session, and I've been informed that lunch is running late. So we do have time, in fact, for another question or two.
I think this is speaking to some of the earlier questions, but also some of the themes that I think are emerging from the discussions. Which is not just linking research to pedagogy, which I think is extremely important, thank you for raising that, but also research translation more broadly, and how, especially not just in terms of the empirical findings and how do we kind of translate that and how does that impact policy, but also conceptual reframings, like, you've talked a lot about whiteness in social work and Georgie, and also concepts like decolonization across a number of different academic fields and social sciences. So we noticed a trend where I think the Young and Resilient Research Centre had a research week event last year on intersectionality, and we were just pleasantly surprised that that had a lot of uptake in youth-facing organizations. So whereas, if in academic terms that's not particularly conceptually innovative anymore. So how do we this, I guess, is pedagogically relevant as well as relevant to our research partnerships. How do we kind of translate that kind of conceptual leading, discourse into pedagogy as well as conversations we have with our research partners?
You have unit outcomes without unit lives without learning outcomes.
Are you looking at me? Thank you. I don't know. That's a good question. but I wonder, I mean, on one hand, the innovation in concepts and theoretical frameworks is driven by intellectual curiosity, and to some extent it is driven by this kind of constant need to, invent a new concept and to gain some kind of visibility through this. So I don't know. I mean, that's a good question, but I don't have an answer for it.
So last week I was in conversation with some academics, and I was doing the performative thing, saying my research will have this impact, and this is the plan, and this is, I will do all this, I will dance the dance, and I will make impactful research, I promise. And then they're like, that's fine. What are you doing in the real world? And that took me a while, because it's like, I don't know, I made a website that probably no one's ever going to see. I talked to the municipality about how they should talk to other people in their community, but I don't think they just nodded along, but I don't think that was any serious impact. So have I left any impact in Bhaktapur? As a city that was reconstructing before I came, reconstructing when I left. Did I make any impact at all? I'm not sure. Maybe 3 people still remember me fondly, and that's nice. But I have talked so much about Bhaktapur to so many people that a city that wasn't too much in the scholarly eye, in the circles that I've been in, that I don't need to always say Bhaktapur, Nepal. And that's a kind of tiny, insignificant impact to the people who live there. But it's something that we do need to be, and that's a question that more academics need to ask. That's fine, you've done the 10 things you're required to do to show the impact according to the metrics and according to the funders. But what did you do to the people that you annoyed and had to spend so much time with? Did they get anything out of it? And I'm not sure that most of us make a real impact in that sense. Sometimes it's cathartic to talk about things, so we could maybe kind of say that, and that's what my ethics application said anyway, that people will feel catharsis in talking to me. I don't think that happened. But mostly I was swatted away like an annoying fly, that just, finish our questions and move on. So did we make an impact? Maybe not. But we should.
The liberty of just asking Danica then, have you...
sorry, can you use the microphone?
Have you followed up, or do you intend to follow up with the people in your research?
I have followed up, and I told them I'm making a website for them to archive their stories, and that will be translated in multiple languages, and that will be a growing archive. And I thought I was doing a great job. And then they sent me a link of a website they'd already made without me. It's way better than I could do. They're like, you told us you're going to make a website. We thought about it. We've made a website. We live here. We know our city. So now I have a website to which I'm just linking their website. I'm like, please go there. It's a better website. So I think we need to acknowledge that we don't necessarily have the kind of impact that we thought.
Exactly, it's what makes things like bug frame and things like that so ridiculous, because it's almost like there's no impact outside of what you do that wouldn't happen anyway, or there's a lot of deadweight things that might happen anyway without your project. But it's nice to know that when you actually do catalyse something, I know after my PhD, I went back to Villages, where I think I worked 3 years later, and I was quite warmly received there, and I did meet Lord Bett, who was a vegetable seller who doesn't read or write, but was a participant in my action research nonetheless. And she was one of the people that was going to become a vegetable supplier to a school canteen that was established as a result of the research project. And I went back 3 years later, and she moved from an iron house with an earth floor into a wooden house on stilts that was very well built. And she said that because of our project, she moved into selling more organic produce in the markets and was earning more money. I don't know if I would be so bold as to attribute my project to that, but it's nice when you follow up later on and see this.
Georgie, I think you can take us out to lunch, which would be great. And if you can say what you'd like to say.
Sure. Really, really quickly, I'd love, please email me. So that handbook of critical whiteness is across disciplines. So it's 102 chapters across 10 sections, from finance to business to all areas, any discipline. And that's the thing, it's a shared conversation. That's my answer to the question. It's a shared conversation. If we are generally going to create pedagogy and practices and perspectives, it needs to be a shared one, and hence why this handbook. Please email me. If you'd like to talk about how, again, whiteness pervades your own disciplinary area, again, because we want to create a shared conversation so everyone's aware of these particular perspectives, not just the social sciences. And I think that can go a long way.
Well, thanks so much, dear panelists. That was a really fascinating session. And before we head out to lunch, just a couple of things. We start at 1:30 sharp for the session on creative practice and cultural research. So that means our lunch, because we arrived a little bit late, will be a bit shorter, but plenty of time to digest. And I think that is everything. So thank you very much.